Okay. Welcome everyone to our presentation on module number 6, Environment and Humanitarian Situations, a very crucial issue for us all, our very survival. And there are many more links to disabled people than perhaps you'd think on the surface of it. So this is the online presentation of module 6 of the Commonwealth Disabled Peoples Forum online course, Disability Equality Capacity Building. And I hope you're all getting on with the work. The course book will be up when this goes up, and there will be a number of follow-up activities in it, and there will also be the seminar the following Friday for you to tune into. I'd like to now go over to Sarah Camus to do the introductory part. Let me just put up the PowerPoint. Yeah. No.
Thank you, Richard.
Hang on, you can start, but I need to do something. Let's just, yeah. I seem to have lost something. Yeah. I'm just having to get number 6 up. Okay. Right, I'll start again. Okay, yes, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I will start introducing this session by a quote from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres that he made on 26 February 2021 on climate change issues. UN climate report, a red alert for the planet by Guterres. And I quote, 2021 is a make or break year to confront the global climate emergency. The science is clear. To limit global temperature rise to 1.5 Celsius, we must cut global emissions by 45% by 2030 from 2010 levels. Today's interim report from the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is a red alert for our planet. It shows governments are nowhere close to the level of ambition needed to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. The major emitters must step up with much more ambitious emissions reductions targets for 2030 in their nationally determined contributions, as well as before the November United Nations Conference in Glasgow. That is the end of the quote. From that quote, we're going to learn from COVID-19 response on how governments made responses to issues of
that's the second slide.
Humanitarian from COVID-19 response or lessons. There is little doubt that COVID-19 and other ongoing virus pandemics are also caused by a crossover between humans, domestics, wild animals, as humans encroach more and more on wild habitats. Our ability to survive as human beings is in the balance. And unless all people talk to each other through their governments, and these governments collaborate on an ongoing basis, we only face more human catastrophes. As disabled people, we learned during the COVID pandemic, our hard-won human rights can be dashed as we tried out of scarce ventilators and don't receive the supports we need to live. We can safeguard our rights and get the humanitarian assistance as owed by governments, implementing Article 11 of the UN RCPT. This can only be done by getting all our countries, the Commonwealth and the UN, to take our human rights seriously as part of greater efforts to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, develop climate justice and support peoples everywhere to live more in harmony with the limited and interconnecting life support system that is planet Earth.
Thank you, sir.
I will also talk about the language that the Commonwealth Disabled People Forum uses for conceptualization's sake. And we use the word disabled people. Why we still choose to call ourselves disabled people is because of the development of the social medical model. In the 19th and 20th century, a disabled person's medical condition was thought to be the root cause of their exclusion from society, an approach now referred to as the medical or individual model of disability. We use the social model of disability where the barriers of environment, attitude, and organization are what disable people with impairments and lead prejudice and discrimination. So to call ourselves persons with disabilities is to accept that we are objects and powerless. We also view ourselves as united by a common oppression and so are proud to identify as disabled people rather than people with disabilities. But when you're talking about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we shall use the term people or persons with disabilities. I hope you get that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what we're going to try and cover in the rest of this presentation is the growing environmental crisis, what lies behind it, the impact on disabled people. We're going to take the example of Kiribati, what must be done. We've got a couple of films and some interesting activity. Kiribati, a population of 100,000, one of the smaller countries of 30 coral atolls in the Pacific, and is probably the first country that will disappear under global warming as sea levels rise. Then we'll look at humanitarian situations and disabled people, armed conflict, accidents, natural disasters, and examples of good practice and what we must be doing. So we've got a quite packed agenda, and we'll get on with it. If we look back to 2018-19, what were the effects there of changes in the environment? 35 million people affected by floods, ocean acidification going on, climate change threatening peatland ecosystems, 1,600 deaths associated with heat waves, 883,000 people internally displaced because of floods and droughts. Global oxygen levels continue to decrease, meaning a loss of that fish, particularly in that environment, and therefore affecting the food chain. 2 million people displaced by weather and climate change. 821 million people undernourished, partly due to drought. So that's quite a big impact for just 1 year. So now a young disabled woman has become very famous.
My name is Greta Thunberg. We are living in the beginning of a mass extinction. Our climate is breaking down. Children like me are giving up their education to protest. But we can still fix this. You can still fix this. To survive, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. But this alone will not be enough. Lots of solutions are talked about. But what about a solution that is right in front of us? I'll let my friend George explain.
There is a magic machine that sucks carbon out of the air, costs very little, and builds itself. It's called a tree. A tree is an example of a natural climate solution. Mangroves, peat bogs, jungles, marshes, seabeds, kelp forests, swamps, coral reefs, they take carbon out of the air and lock it away. Nature is a tool we can use to repair our broken climate. These natural climate solutions could make a massive difference.
Pretty cool, right?
But only if we also leave fossil fuels in the ground.
Here's the crazy part. Right now, we are ignoring them. We spend 1,000 times more on global fossil fuel subsidies than on natural-based solutions.
Natural climate solutions get just 2% of all the money used on tackling climate breakdown.
This is your money. It is your taxes and your savings.
Even more crazy, right now when we need nature the most, we're destroying it faster than ever.
Up to 200 species are going extinct every single day.
Much of the Arctic ice is gone. Most of our wild animals have gone. Much of our soil has gone.
So what should we do?
What should you do?
It's simple. We need to protect, restore, and fund. Protect. Tropical forests are being cut down at the rate of 30 football pitches a minute.
Where nature is doing something vital, we must protect it.
Restore. Much of our planet has been damaged.
But nature can regenerate, and we can help ecosystems bounce back.
Fund.
We need to stop funding things that destroy nature and pay for things that help it.
It is that simple. Protect, restore, fund.
This can happen everywhere. Many people have already begun using natural climate solutions. We need to do it on a massive scale.
You can be part of this.
Vote for people who defend nature.
Share this video. Talk about this.
All around the world, there are amazing movements fighting for nature. Join them.
Everything counts. What you do counts. Is not a
Great message. And really, that crisis, we as disabled people and DPOs, we need to put ourselves right in the middle of it and the fight, because we will be the ones who more than any others are disadvantaged by the effects of climate change. Medically, the quality of healthcare, equipment, supplies and medicines are affected by all of these events. Life quality, personal assistance, accessible housing, transportation, funding and stability, social services, benefits, employment, community, family support. These things take time to develop among an at-risk population such as disabled people. Change, which is definitely coming from climate change and environmental crisis, requires we start planning now. We need to be talking to our governments about how they have plans which include us with all of these events. So the impact of the eco-crisis on everyone: floods, droughts, fires, heat waves. Direct impact: stronger and more frequent storms. Indirect impact: infrastructure changes. Expanding droughts and forest fires leads to food insecurity. Sea level rises and acidification leads to poor health and poor food. More intensive heat leads to more economic disruption. General weather patterns are changing. Environment and ecosystems are getting more unstable. We're losing habitat, which is leading to people to move from where they live. It is estimated that between 200 million and 1 billion people will have to move from where they live in the next 30 years. Impact on disability: non-disabled people will be made more impaired. Greater prevalence of impairment by storm-related injuries, crop shortages leading to malnutrition and stunting, invasive diseases. The control programs we had for malaria and even things like polio will come back, and new variants of virus will come more and more as the crossover between the wild, where many of these viruses live, and human habitation becomes more and more. Increased war and armed conflict is also likely, which leads to a great deal of impairment, and poverty leads to impairment we saw in Module 5. For us directly as disabled people, inaccessible shelter and evacuation, we won't be thought about in these emergency measures unless we get thought about now. Fragile support systems. We need medical and PAs to be available. We need recovery finance. So whatever's affected, as we've seen in COVID, we can build back better. We have to be able to build back better after all of these environmental events. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Air quality affects respiratory and heart conditions, will lead to greater problems for us, and we will all become poorer. So key issues for planning ahead. We need to be involved as DPOs in every stage of planning. We need to try and mitigate by cutting emissions. DPOs have solidarity with climate campaigners. When there's an Extinction Rebellion or other demonstration, make sure you're out there as disabled people with your banner and making placards which show why we are directly affected by this. Planned disaster relief and recovery is accessible and takes our needs into account. Accessible shelters and transit systems need to be built in. The planning, relief and recovery is really important, that the emergency services know where disabled people live and how to rescue them and what's needed for them. Benefit and healthcare and social care support is sufficient. All of this must be done with communications that are accessible and easy to understand. Employment and benefit security is not affected, or if it is, it needs to be subsidized so people can still have a livelihood. Local support must be available, and we need local independent living centers, including in refugee camps and other places where we are temporarily housed. Okay, so let's have a look at the impact of this in one particular series of coral atolls in Kiribati.
Scientific research shows that the Pacific is the region most affected in the entire world by climate change. One of the biggest threats is sea level rise. And that's because Kiribati, which is composed of 33 low-lying atolls, is no more than 4 meters high at the highest point. And in Kiribati, we can say that 100% of the population lives within 1 kilometer of the coast. So the country is extremely vulnerable. Given that the scientific research shows that by 2100, it's almost certain now that we'll have more than a meter of sea level rise. On a flat island like Kiribati, that amount of sea level rise comes very far inland. So it's a very serious situation. And for that reason, the government is looking at options for relocating the population.
When I came here in 2002, this place now has been completely changed. Now, as you can see, it's like a swamp, right? How many more years time, and then it will be completely nobody live in this village.
We've seen the scenarios, the projections put forward by the scientific community. I am not being pessimistic. I'm being very realistic. And I think as a leader, it's important that we provide options. Even if there is that 1% possibility that it will happen, we must provide the options for our people. One thing that I've always emphasized is that we never wish to be refugees. And we would be refugees if we don't do anything now. Because a refugee is a response to an unexpected event, okay? But we know it's coming, so we should be acting accordingly, beginning from now.
And then we would have our people, if they need to migrate with dignity, not as refugees.
I have moved 3 times. Every 3 years I move. My place house is about 20 meters from here, 15 meters to 20 meters from where I'm standing. After another 3 years, I have to move away from here and build another home there.
And that's your house just over the sea wall?
Yeah, that's my last house. I'm not quite sure how long I will be there. But that depends on how strong my seawall here will stand high tide waves. Nothing we can do about it.
People are beginning to understand, but the older ones, it's very, very hard for them because it's very attached to the land. If you have a land, you have to stay and die there, and it's very hard to leave your islands. One time we went to the cemetery and there was a funeral took place, and this coffin was put into the ground, but somehow it's floating on this in there, it's floating, and they have to put stone to put it right to us. It's very important for our ancestors where you bury your dead.
I don't want to live here because I was born here and my ancestors lives here as well. But if that fact affects me, then I will have you to live here. I feel very sad, and it hurts to leave where you come from. The scientists have said that in 50 years, Kiribati will submerge underwater. That's not a happy thought.
Carbon trading will be of no consequence to us. So there has got to be some very special provisions for the victims, not the potential victims, the victims, because we are victims. And so there's got to be some very deep soul searching on the part of people to do something about it. Will we remain a sovereign nation? Will we remain a people? Will we be able to maintain the identity and the culture that we have? And my answer is yes. I will do everything in my power to be able to do so. But at what cost? And who is going to pay for it?
So, Tia Toa Matoa, which is our affiliate, which is the National Disability Organization in Kiribati, have been talking to the government and have managed to get into their policy and action plan from 2018 to 2001 that the government developed a guide to assist all government of Kiribati ministers to include people with disabilities in all services, programs and plans. I think that's a long way further than most people have got. Maintain a register of prioritized GOK strategic and operational policies to be reviewed against the CRPD. Review the Kiribati Joint Implementation Plan for Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management to assess its inclusiveness of disabled people. Develop standard operating procedures to address the needs of disabled people. A guide for inclusion is developed, and TTDM and other stakeholders are consulted about the priority. So that's pretty strong stuff they've managed to get there. An implementation plan with timelines is being used to manage and monitor and review. Churches, faith-based organizations are actively contributing to actions outlined. The strategic plan is developed and people with disabilities are included in all planning processes. Needs of people with disabilities are included in Island Council strategic plans and budgets. Conduct workshops with disabled people and sports stakeholders to identify, ensure access and inclusion, include people with disabilities in sport, recreation, leisure, conduct access audits on sporting facilities, and seek resources to modify facilities and ensure accessibility, increase opportunities. So this is a DPO turning a crisis into them being involved. Now, clearly they're all going to lose their home in the next few years, and already talks are being conducted with New Zealand and Australia about allowing the whole population of 100,000 to move there. Clearly with some migrant control politicians in charge in Australia, there are big problems with that, but these people will have to go somewhere and re-establish, as will millions of others. And so it's and after all, the global warming is not caused by people in the Pacific, as they will tell you. It's caused by the big industrial countries who are burning hydrocarbons at an enormous rate. And therefore, there is moral responsibility to create spaces where people can, with dignity, as the president said, move to. Now, they've made up, TTMT, Toa Matoa have made up a song, which I'll play for you now, with a film about what they think about this. Very Pacific orientated thing. Oh. Actually confronting the situation they face. I think we should all gain from that. Another area which causes a great deal of problems for disabled people and creates disability is armed conflict and war. During conflicts, many challenges arise from civilians affected. These challenges are heightened for disabled people as institutional attitude and environmental barriers and risk factors are exacerbated in crisis of conflict. PTSD and psychological traumas are usually massively underestimated, and psychological trauma arises. The disability of war casualties depends on the nature of their impairment, the quality of their medical treatment, and the rehabilitation they receive, and how effectively the barriers they face are overcome. In modern wars, people are much more likely to survive and therefore have an impairment. Take the American Civil War in the 1860s, half of people who were injured died. In the more recent war in Iraq, on the American side, only 1 in 6 people died, but of course that meant 5 out of 6 would have had a major lifelong impairment. More than 240 regional civil wars have occurred since the ending of the World War II, and millions have developed lifelong impairments. Chemicals such as Agent Orange have had long-term effects on health impact on both troops and civilians. Landmines left in the ground impact largely on children playing and women gathering wood. Since the Landmine Treaty in 1999, adopted by 160 countries, casualties have fallen from about 20,000 a year to only 4,000 a year, so something can be done. Over the last 100 years, rape and sexual abuse of women and children has moved from being seen as part of the spoils of war. It is now actually a weapon of war, a gendered war weapon, and that has to be banned and challenged. Looking at the First World War, which was, of course, a war, an imperial war, where the British Empire, now the Commonwealth, were asked to pay their part, it's often forgotten on the Western Front that there were 1.4 million soldiers from Greater India, that 47,000 died and 65,000 were disabled. Or in Africa, that 71,000 died and 100,000 were wounded. And there are pictures up of different soldiers from India and a group in Brighton convalescing from their injuries, King's Royal Rifles in East Africa. I'm now putting up a picture of the Tower of London with ceramic red poppies all around it. And this was a memorial that was done in 2014 for the 100th centenary of the beginning of the First World War. 88,246 military dead from the Commonwealth or the Empire and from the UK. But what was never thought about after the war was that there were 2,400,000 people came back from that war disabled. For a land fit for heroes, or was it? They were treated really badly, but eventually went on to fight for the first disability legislation that came into the UK and in other parts of the Commonwealth. Accidents and disability. On the night of December the 2nd, 1984, approximately 40 tons of toxic gas spewed from a factory owned by US giant Union Carbide in Bhopal, a city in the heartland of India. Blown by the winds, the gas covered more than 40 square kilometers. The entire population of Old Bhopal was affected. Pregnant women miscarried as they ran. Children died in their parents' arms. Hospitals were overwhelmed by the dead and dying for days afterwards. That night ultimately ended, but years of death and suffering and impairment resulted. And similarly, you could say for nuclear accidents like Chernobyl and many others that have happened because of the lack of safety and control of dangerous substances that occurs in the pursuit of profit by many companies, or else just efficiency. The UNCRPD Article 11 is really important, and it states, for humanitarian emergencies, state parties shall take, in accordance with their obligations under international law, including international obligations and human rights law, all necessary measures to ensure and protect the safety and of disabled people, and in situations of risk, including situations which of armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, such as the things we've been looking at, caused by global warming, caused by the eco-catastrophe. So are you still with us, Sarah? Do you want to go through the next few?
Yes, I'm here, Richard.
Okay, so this is some of the problems that are caused from these various natural disasters, so-called. So if you'd like to take us through the next few slides.
Thank you, Richard. I'll take you through the slides of the daily problems of accessibility. It has a direct physical impact with loss of mobility, damage and or loss of assistive devices, an increased dependency, loss of comfort, and a disruption in daily routine. During crisis situations, based on the latest statistics, 80% of adults on the autism spectrum are dependent on some of the public transport. And when disaster strikes, this may lead to the disruption in daily routine and eventually the loss of independence. The challenges mentioned will occur in some form of disorientation, the struggle with planning, organization, and crisis management. For example, during the Hudhud cyclone in Visakhapatnam in India, in 2014, Sai Padma, founder of Global Aid and a wheelchair user, was stuck in her house for 20 days because a tree fell at the entrance of her house and a wheelchair could not move until the tree was removed. Those are issues of accessibility. Then we have physical risks, lack of access to medical treatment, and secondary health issues like fever, infection, and high rate of abuse during crisis, including physical, psychological, food, water, and other forms, including sexual. For example, during Cyclone Vada in Chennai in India, a 20-year-old was on a ventilator and the power shut down because the cyclone meant that she quickly needed to arrange an alternative. It took several hours for her life to be saved. We also have inclusion of disability in disaster management. There's a link there that you can look into to see the kind of risk that is involved. And also we now go to psychological issues, which include aggravation of depression, diminished and or loss of self-confidence, emotional vulnerability, general frustration, self-doubt, depression. The psychological challenges, as mentioned, can be associated with a physical cause and effect response, such as self-harm or stimming. Example in Thailand, the rapid mental health needs assessment after tsunami in 2004 was done by researchers as a part of public health emergency response. The report revealed that while symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorders were found among 12% of displaced and 7% of non-disabled persons, anxiety symptoms were found among 37% of displaced, and depression was reported by 30% of displaced survivors. We also have acquiring new secondary conditions when it comes to this disaster and humanitarian risks. There is psychological problems or ulcers, pressure sores, contractures, or reduced hearing or vision. When overstimulated, sensory stimulus that is received from the different senses can lead to the fight or flight response. The key term here is sensory or auditory blindness, where visual and auditory sensory stimulus is restricted and can therefore affect the outcome and reaction. For example, in Bhubaneswar, a study conducted on 323 households with disabled children showed 82 children who were improving in gait training or sitting balance had developed curvatures, undergone muscle weakness, and lost sitting balance due to lack of therapy during the lockdown period. There are also livelihood issues coming with these situations. Livelihood issues like destruction of existing livelihoods, disruption of markets, and problems with government disability allowance. For example, in India, according to Salma Mahbub, General Secretary of Bangladesh Society for the Change and Advocacy Nexus, June was a particularly difficult month. This is what he said. June was particularly a difficult month for disabled people. The survival packages, financial assistance, and sanitation support undertaken were not reaching them properly. Again, in many places, the ones who did not have the disability cards were excluded from any sort of support. We are expecting a second wave of COVID, but till now, no protection measures exist for those who lost their jobs. So those are issues that come up with humanitarian and risky situations.
So in the light of what we were hearing from India there, this is a film from India which is really showing the risk to disabled people in general, which sort of backs up the points that you've been making, Sarah. I'll show.
Disasters such as floods, cyclones, tsunamis, and earthquakes are on the rise, causing a massive loss of life and assets. This scenario is further aggravated by human activities that are adding to these risks. Though the world is more aware than ever towards preparedness to save lives and assets, there is a need to recognize that disasters have worst impact on people and communities that are poor or at risk for different reasons. Various reports suggest that during 2004 to 14, the mortality rate of people with disabilities has been 2 to 4 times greater than the non-disabled members of community. People with disabilities face unique or additional challenges during disasters, some of which is related to exclusion and barriers that already exist in society. For instance, a person with hearing impairment is likely to miss out on warning announcements through audio broadcast. Similarly, the visual warnings, symbols, and signposts that are displayed will not be accessible for a person with blindness. And during earthquakes, a person with intellectual disability will find it very stressful to cope with an unfamiliar situation in the campsite in absence of a caregiver or a family member. We need to ensure that disaster risk reduction is inclusive. This can happen only when people with disabilities are involved in all stages of disaster preparedness and response. People with disabilities must be meaningfully represented in disaster management committees. There is a need for data to be broken down in terms of age, gender, and disabilities for enabling policymakers and agencies to plan and respond effectively. Let's ask governments and organizations to make disaster risk reduction disability inclusive. This can be done by implementing the Sendai framework and the Dhaka Declaration on Disability and Disaster Risk Management. Through this, we can ensure that no one is left behind next time a disaster strikes.
A film which I think
disasters.
Film which shows all of the main points. So do you want to read this, or shall I go on and then you do the last bit? What do you want to do, Sarah?
I can do the last one.
Okay. So the main barriers that impede access to services is no information on what type of service existed, no knowledge of where to access services, the service was too far from temporary or home locations, couldn't afford to get there, special services didn't exist, special services were too expensive, special services were not physically accessible, there were no trained staff to support, and the staff couldn't understand needs, lack of empathy from service providers, and lack of expert advice. So what the film was saying is disaster risk reduction needs to happen long before the disaster actually strikes. So that when it does happen, there is a well thought out plan that then kicks in and actually provides the support that's actually needed. So here's another, having a look at severe weather. This is an Australian little short clip, which I think helps to explain some of those points again. So let's have a look at this. Hopefully it will work. Yeah, it's working now.
People with disabilities are amongst the most vulnerable when it comes to severe weather events like floods and storms. Because of poverty, many people with disability live in areas that are susceptible and often can't quickly escape to safety. Add to this the long-term impacts for survivors after these events, like disease, difficulties accessing clean water, hygienic sanitation, food and shelter. And it's clear that from initial impact through to recovery, for people with disabilities, every stage of a natural disaster is far more difficult and dangerous.
When it comes to floods and other disasters, people with disabilities are particularly vulnerable. There is generally widespread panic, and in many cases, a person with a disability is forgotten and left behind. So now I am part of a disaster preparedness committee, and we've made a list of all people with a disability in our area, and we can take immediate steps to locate and evacuate them.
Disaster preparedness training programs across many communities in poor countries are proving very successful. However, people with disabilities are often excluded from the process of developing these response plans. There can be no exception. People with disabilities must be included in planning programs, practice response drills and evacuations if they're to have a chance at survival. Their ideas and input on specific risks and needs is essential in making sure that when disaster strikes, the whole community is prepared to get every one of its members to safety. By joining together, when weather-related disasters happen, we can reduce the impact for people with disabilities. We can end the cycle.
So, advanced preparation for a disaster, the key points then. Equal access to shelter facilities, equal access to evacuation and transport, equal access to disaster cleanup, accessible shelters, physical access, accessible communication in alternative languages, accessible paths, accessible toilets, accessible sleeping equipment, access to food and healthcare needs, assistive devices, facilities for power for people who need to recharge their power chairs, for instance. And there's another thing. If schools are closed and they're inclusive schools, then the temporary schools need to also be inclusive, and they need to be in the charities and disaster organizations that produce schools in a box. There need to be differentiated materials so that those can be available. After Cyclone Sidra in Bangladesh in 2007, a number of cyclone shelters were built using foreign aid. Despite information on the importance and how to of accessible design, the shelters were not constructed to be accessible. As a study stated, not a single one of them have ramps or any other accessible features, even when the stairs are high and risky. In other words, making shelters and other temporary accommodation accessible for everybody is better for everybody, and we should really be in there being consulted and being asked. So what have we learned from this and many of the lessons which are held in the course book? There are many more of them. Over to you, Sarah. What have we learned from the case studies?
Yeah, what we have learned from these case studies is that there is need for inclusive disaster risk reduction and preparedness, and that disabled people and DPOs can have a critical role to play in disaster risk reduction and preparedness if they're involved in the planning stages and if they are consciously thought about by those planning the same. Collecting and using disability disaggregated data for assessment and programming relevant is very important, because we need to know who we are planning for, who we need to rescue, and what type of assistance that they require. There's also the lesson of participation of disabled people and their respective organization in humanitarian response and recovery, very key, so that they can be able to be safe when such disasters occur. Removing barriers to access humanitarian assistance and protection. Disabled people are the most effective and strongest advocates to call for the elimination of barriers to their services. So they need to advocate more and hold their governments to account for even giving them the safety that they require during humanitarian situations, and making sure that their environments are conducive and friendly to their type of impairments. We also learned that influencing coordination and mechanism and resource mobilization to be inclusive, advocating for an inclusive humanitarian response for disabled people in a specific crisis can have positive outcomes. So the inclusiveness in the resource mobilization is key, so that it also caters for the special amenities that are required to cater for issues of persons with disabilities during the response. Thank you, and over to you, Richard.
Thank you. Just to finish then, really, I think this has been quite a whistle-stop tour from a global crisis, taking it down to the local level. But obviously climate change, natural disasters, food emergencies, all of these things will impinge directly on the life of the 1 billion disabled people, as they will on everybody else. But the reality is, if there's a tsunami coming, you are the last person, if you're mobility impaired, who's going to be able to get away from that. If you are in a situation where everything has changed because of a COVID lockdown, and you're a deaf person and you can't hear what the police are saying to keep off the streets during a curfew, you're going to be the person that gets shot. And we heard last week from Uganda how that had happened to a couple of deaf people. And we were talking about war. Nothing changes much. In the First World War, many disabled people, because people from Britain went to fight, disabled people were the reserve army and brought into the munitions factories. But in fact, a factory in North London, there were about 20 deaf people working there, but the soldiers who were guarding it hadn't been told to actually communicate with them. So again, 100 years ago or more, these munition workers, several of them were shot by the sentries, not understanding the communication. So the link between what happened then and what happened in Uganda, do we never learn anything? That's why DPOs need to be around the table, why we need to be there, actually saying what needs to be in a disaster response. But we also need to take active participation in preparing governments and holding governments to account to actually reduce the causes of many of these disasters. So I hope you've learned a lot in this module. I'd like to thank you, Sarah, and Gemma behind the scenes, and Julia, our captioner, and we'll see you again at the seminars. Thank you very much.
Thank you.